June 24, 2024, the day the world almost didn't notice. Let me tell you about the moment I realized how close we might be to a catastrophic miscalculation in the Caribbean. It wasn't some dramatic standoff in the Taiwan Strait or a Russian missile test near NATO borders. It was a quiet, almost routine announcement from the Venezuelan ministry of a large-scale naval exercise in international waters, just 200 nautical miles north of Margarita Island. Harmless, right? A sovereign nation flexing its muscles in its own backyard. Except for one small detail, the exercise zone overlapped with the projected path of the USS Gerald R. Ford, the most advanced aircraft carrier in the world, which had just completed a routine port call in Colombia. Now, I've spent the last 3 decades studying the intersection of military posturing and geopolitical brinkmanship, and let me be, this wasn't just another drill. The Ford wasn't in the region to admire the beaches. It was there because the US has spent the last 2 years systematically escalating pressure on Venezuela, sanctions, covert operations, even a failed coup attempt in 2019, all while pretending that the Monroe Doctrine is a relic of the past. And Venezuela? They've spent those same 2 years watching their economy collapse, their people flee, and their government grow increasingly desperate. Desperate regimes do desperate things. And when a desperate regime starts running war games near a US carrier strike group, you don't dismiss it as posturing. You what if they actually mean it? The mainstream narrative, of course, is that this is all just theater. The Pentagon calls it standard deterrence. The State Department insists Venezuela is too weak to pose a real threat. The media, when they cover it at all, frame it as a footnote in the broader story of US great power competition with China and Russia. But here's the problem with that: it ignores the one thing history has taught us about crises: they don't happen because someone planned them. They happen because someone miscalculates. And right now, the conditions for miscalculation are as ripe as they've been in decades. The official deterrence, democracy, and diplomatic theater. If you've been following the news, here's what you've been: the US has a carrier strike group in the Caribbean to deter aggression and support regional stability. Venezuela, led by Nicolas Maduro, is a rogue state that has repeatedly violated international norms, rigging elections, jailing opponents, and allegedly collaborating with drug cartels. The Ford's presence is a show of force, a reminder that the US won't tolerate further destabilization in its near abroad. The Venezuelan naval exercise? Just bluster. Maduro knows he can't win a direct confrontation, so he's playing to his domestic audience, trying to rally nationalist sentiment against the Yankee imperialists. The data seems to support this. Venezuela's military is a shadow of what it was in the 1980s. Its navy consists of a handful of aging frigates, a few diesel submarines, and a collection of patrol boats. Its air force is grounded by lack of spare parts. Its economy is in shambles, with inflation so high that the central bank stopped publishing figures. The US, by contrast, has the most powerful military in history, with the Ford alone carrying more firepower than most countries' entire armed forces. A direct attack on a US carrier would be, in the words of one Pentagon official, suicidal. And yet, here's where the official narrative starts to unravel. The hidden desperation, proxy wars, and the illusion of weakness. Let's start with the most obvious: why would Venezuela even consider attacking a US carrier? The answer isn't just because Maduro is a madman. It's because the US has spent the last decade backing him into a corner with no exit. First, the sanctions. The US has imposed some of the most draconian economic measures in modern history on Venezuela, cutting it off from global financial markets, seizing its overseas assets, and even banning it from selling oil, the lifeblood of its economy. The result? A 75% collapse in GDP since 2013. Millions of Venezuelans have fled the country. Those who remain face chronic shortages of food, medicine, and fuel. Now, you might argue that Maduro brought this on himself, and in many ways, he did. But here's the thing: they don't just punish the regime. They radicalize it. When a government has nothing left to lose, it starts looking for asymmetric ways to fight back. And that's where things get dangerous. Second, the covert war. The US has a long history of regime change operations in Latin America, and Venezuela is no exception. In 2019, the Trump administration openly backed Juan Guaido's self-declaration as interim president, funneling millions in aid to opposition groups and even attempting a botched coup. More recently, there have been reports of U.S. intelligence agencies working with Colombian and Brazilian operatives to destabilize Maduro's government. The Venezuelan military, for its part, has accused the U.S. of supporting assassination plots and cyber attacks on its infrastructure. Now, imagine you're Maduro. Your economy is in ruins. Your people are starving. The U.S. is openly trying to overthrow you. And then, suddenly, an American aircraft carrier, the most visible symbol of U.S. power, shows up just off your coast. What do? The official narrative says you back down. But history says you lash out. Third, the illusion of Venezuelan weakness. Yes, Venezuela's military is a fraction of what it once was. But that doesn't mean it's defenseless. The country has spent the last decade investing in asymmetric capabilities, anti-ship missiles, drones, and even a reported stockpile of Russian-made hypersonic weapons. In 2020, Venezuela conducted a live-fire exercise with its Russian-supplied S-300 air defense system, a clear message to the U.S. that any airstrikes would come at a cost. And let's not Venezuela has one of the largest oil reserves in the world. If Maduro were to sabotage those fields in a desperate act of defiance, the economic fallout would be global. But here's the part the media isn't talking: Venezuela doesn't have to sink the carrier to win. All it has to do is force the U.S. into a position where it either backs down or escalates into a full-blown war. And in the current geopolitical climate, that's a gamble Maduro might be willing to take. The broader geopolitical why this isn't just about Venezuela. Now, let's out. Because this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the unraveling of the post-Cold War order and the desperate struggle of the U.S. to maintain its global dominance in the face of rising challengers. For the last 30 years, the U.S. has operated under the assumption that it can project power anywhere in the world without consequence. It invaded Iraq on false pretenses. It bombed Libya into chaos. It backed coups in Ukraine and Bolivia. It waged a 20-year war in Afghanistan that ended in humiliating defeat. And through it all, it has treated Latin America as its backyard, a region where it can intervene at will, overthrow governments, and impose sanctions without fear of retaliation. But the world is changing. China is now the largest trading partner of most Latin American countries. Russia has re-emerged as a major player in the region, supplying weapons to Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. And the U.S.'s own allies, even in Europe, are growing weary of its endless wars and economic coercion. So when the Ford shows up off the coast of Venezuela, it's not just about Maduro. It's about sending a message to Beijing, and the Monroe Doctrine is alive and well. Stay out of our hemisphere. But here's the: China and Russia aren't staying out. In fact, they're doing everything they can to exploit U.S. overreach. Let's start with Russia. Moscow has been Venezuela's primary military patron for years, supplying everything from fighter jets to missile systems. In 2019, Russia even sent 2 nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in a show of support. More recently, there have been reports of Russian military advisors helping Venezuela develop its drone and cyber warfare capabilities. The message is: if the U.S. pushes too hard, Russia will push back. Then there's China. Beijing has invested billions in Venezuelan oil infrastructure, and it's one of the few countries still buying Venezuelan crude despite U.S. sanctions. More importantly, China has a strategic interest in keeping the U.S. bogged down in its own hemisphere. The more resources the U.S. devotes to Latin America, the fewer it has to confront China in the South China Sea or Taiwan. And if Venezuela were to attack a U.S. carrier? That would be a gift to Beijing, a crisis that forces the U.S. to divert attention and resources away from Asia. Now, I'm not saying China or Russia are directly encouraging Venezuela to attack the Ford. But they don't have to. All they have to do is make sure the U.S. knows that any escalation in Venezuela will have consequences far beyond the Caribbean. And that brings us to the most dangerous part of this whole: the U.S. is playing a game it can't win. The military: why a Venezuelan attack would be a disaster. Let's be: if Venezuela were to launch a direct attack on a U.S. aircraft carrier, the result would be catastrophic for Venezuela, for the region, and possibly for the world. The Ford is not just a ship. It's the centerpiece of a carrier strike group, which includes guided missile cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and a full wing of F-35 and F/A-18 fighter jets. Its air defenses are designed to intercept everything from ballistic missiles to swarming drones. Its electronic warfare capabilities can jam radar and communications. And its offensive power is a single carrier air wing can deliver more ordnance in a day than most countries' entire air forces. Venezuela, by contrast, has a few aging frigates, a handful of patrol boats, and a small fleet of submarines that may or may not be operational. Its air force is a mix of 1980s-era MiG-29s and Sukhoi Su-30s, most of which are grounded due to lack of maintenance. Its missile arsenal is limited, and while it has some anti-ship capabilities, they're no match for the Ford's Aegis defense system. So, on paper, this isn't a fight. It's a slaughter. But here's the thing about modern: it's not about who has the biggest guns. It's about who can absorb the most pain. And Venezuela has one advantage the US doesn't: it has nothing left to lose. If Maduro were to order an attack on the Ford, he wouldn't need to sink it. He just needs to damage it enough to force a US withdrawal. A single lucky missile strike, a well-placed drone swarm, or even a cyber attack on the carrier's systems could cause enough chaos to make the US think twice about staying in the region. And if the US were to retaliate with a full-scale invasion? That would be a nightmare scenario, a prolonged guerrilla war in the jungles and cities of Venezuela, with Russia and China arming the resistance from the shadows. Now, I'm not saying Venezuela could win. But I am saying that the US would pay a price it's not prepared to pay. And in the age of social media and 24-hour news cycles, even a single American casualty could trigger a political firestorm back home. But here's where it gets even more: the US might not have a choice but to escalate. The domestic political pressure: why Biden can't back down. Let's talk about the elephant in the American politics. Joe Biden is in a bind. His approval ratings are in the toilet. The economy is shaky. The border crisis is dominating headlines. And the 2024 election is shaping up to be a rematch with Donald Trump, who has spent the last 4 years painting Biden as weak on national security. Now, imagine this: the Ford is in the Caribbean. Venezuela launches a surprise attack, maybe a missile strike, maybe a drone swarm. The carrier is damaged, but not sunk. A few American sailors are killed. The footage goes viral. Fox News runs wall-to-wall: Biden's weakness emboldens Maduro. Trump: we need a president who won't let America be humiliated. What does Biden do? If he orders a retaliatory strike, he risks a wider war. If he does nothing, he looks weak. And in an election year, weakness is the one thing no president can afford. This is the trap of American foreign policy in the 21st century. The US has spent decades building a global military presence that it can't afford to retreat from, even when retreat is the smartest option. And now, with the 2024 election looming, the pressure to do something is stronger than ever. But here's the American people are tired of endless wars. They're tired of trillion-dollar conflicts in the Middle East. They're tired of seeing their sons and daughters come home in body bags. And they're especially tired of wars that have no clear purpose. So if Biden were to escalate in Venezuela, he'd be doing it not because it's the right strategic move, but because he's afraid of looking weak. And that's a recipe for disaster. The what happens next? Alright, let's game this out. What are the most likely outcomes if Venezuela attacks the Ford? Scenario 1, the limited strike. Venezuela launches a single, symbolic attack, a missile that misses, a drone that's shot down, or a cyber attack that causes minor disruptions. The US responds with a proportional strike, maybe taking out a Venezuelan radar station or a missile battery. Both sides declare victory and de-escalate. The Ford withdraws, and the US imposes even harsher sanctions. Maduro survives, but the Venezuelan people suffer even more. China and Russia quietly increase their support for Caracas. The crisis fades from the headlines, but the underlying tensions remain. Scenario 2, the escalation spiral. Venezuela launches a more serious attack, maybe a coordinated missile and drone strike that damages the Ford and kills a few American sailors. The US retaliates with airstrikes on Venezuelan military bases, sinking several ships and destroying key infrastructure. Maduro, facing domestic unrest, orders a counterattack, possibly targeting US assets in Colombia or the Caribbean. The US responds with a full-scale invasion, toppling Maduro's government but getting bogged down in a protracted insurgency. Russia and China arm the resistance, turning Venezuela into a new Afghanistan. The US economy takes a hit from rising oil prices. Biden loses the election. The world edges closer to a direct US-Russia or US-China confrontation. Scenario 3, the unthinkable. Venezuela, with Russian or Chinese support, launches a surprise attack that cripples the fort, killing hundreds of American sailors. The US responds with overwhelming force, invading Venezuela within days. But Maduro has a secret weapon, maybe a dirty bomb, maybe a cyber attack on US infrastructure. The conflict spreads to Colombia, Brazil, and beyond. Russia and China, seeing an opportunity to weaken the US, escalate their own operations in Ukraine and Taiwan. The global economy collapses. Nuclear threats are made. The world stands on the brink of World War III. Now, I want to be none of these scenarios are good. Even the best-case scenario leaves Venezuela in ruins and the US looking like a bully. The most likely scenario is a prolonged, bloody conflict that achieves nothing. And the worst-case scenario? Well, let's just say it's the kind of thing that keeps me up at night. The grand strategy why the US keeps losing. So how did we get here? How did the US, the most powerful country in history, find itself in a position where a broken, impoverished nation like Venezuela can credibly threaten its military dominance? The answer lies in the fundamental flaw of American the belief that military power alone can solve political problems. For the last 30 years, the US has operated under the assumption that it can reshape the world in its own image through force. It invaded Iraq to spread democracy. It bombed Libya to protect civilians. It backed coups in Latin America to promote stability. And through it all, it has treated diplomacy as an afterthought, a box to be checked after the bombs have already fallen. But here's the military power is not the same as political power. You can destroy a country's army, but you can't destroy its will to resist. You can overthrow a government, but you can't force people to accept your vision of the world. And you can impose sanctions, but you can't control how the target responds. Venezuela is the perfect example of this failure. The US has spent years trying to strangle the Maduro regime into submission, but all it's done is radicalize the government and impoverish the people. And now, with the fort sitting off the coast, the US is left with a back down and look weak, or escalate and risk a wider war. This is the pattern of American foreign policy in the 21st century. The US keeps getting into conflicts it can't win, because it refuses to accept that the world is no longer willing to be dominated. And the more it tries to assert its power, the more it undermines its own position. We saw this in Iraq. We saw it in Afghanistan. We saw it in Libya. And now, we're seeing it in Venezuela. The lesson is the era of American hegemony is over. The world is becoming multipolar, and the US can either adapt or keep stumbling into one disaster after another. What should we do? What should we do? The first instinct of the Washington establishment would be to double down. They'd call for more sanctions, more military exercises, more shows of force. Some hawk in a think tank would pen an op-ed demanding a preemptive strike on Venezuela's missile sites, while a retired admiral would go on cable news to warn that backing down would embolden China and Russia. The script is always the escalate, escalate, escalate. But here's the uncomfortable escalation is exactly what Venezuela wants. Not because Maduro is a strategic genius, he's not, but because he's cornered. A regime that spent the last decade looting its own country, jailing opponents, and presiding over the largest economic collapse in modern Latin American history outside of war doesn't have many cards left to play. But it does have the ability to force the US into a lose-lose scenario. If we back down, we look weak. If we strike, we hand Maduro a propaganda victory and give Moscow and Beijing an excuse to deepen their involvement. Either way, the US loses. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader collapse of American deterrence in the Western Hemisphere. For decades, the U.S. treated Latin America as its backyard, a region where it could intervene at will without consequence. But that era is over. The Monroe Doctrine died the day China became the top trading partner of Brazil, Argentina, and Chile. It was buried when Russia started selling arms to Nicaragua and when Iran began running weapons to Venezuela. And it was cremated when the U.S. itself spent the last 20 years distracted by wars in the Middle East, leaving a power vacuum that others were all too happy to fill. Let me explain why this matters. The U.S. still has the most powerful military on earth, but military power is only as effective as the political strategy behind it. And right now, the U.S. doesn't have one. We're stuck in a 20th century mindset, where we assume that if we flex our muscles, our adversaries will back down. But that's not how the world works anymore. Today, our adversaries Russia, China, Iran, even smaller players like Venezuela, are playing a different game. They're not trying to match us tank for tank or carrier for carrier. They're trying to make it too costly for us to use our power at all. Take the Ford sitting off Venezuela's coast. On paper, it's an unstoppable force. But in reality, it's a floating liability. Every day it stays there, it's a target. Every day it stays there, it's a symbol of American overreach. And every day it stays there, it gives Maduro an opportunity to rally his people around the idea that Venezuela is standing up to the Yankee Empire. That's not just propaganda, that's geopolitical jujitsu. The weaker party doesn't need to win. It just needs to make the stronger party bleed enough that it decides the fight isn't worth it. Here's another uncomfortable: the US has no good options in Venezuela because it spent years ignoring the problem until it became a crisis. We sanctioned the country into the ground, assuming that economic pain would force Maduro out. But dictatorships don't collapse from sanctions, they collapse from within, or they don't collapse at all. And while we were waiting for the Venezuelan people to rise up, we let the situation fester. We let Russia and China deepen their ties with Caracas. We let Iran turn Venezuela into a forward operating base for its proxy networks. And we let Maduro turn the country into a narco-state, flooding the region with cocaine and corruption. Now, we're left with do we keep pretending that sanctions and military posturing will somehow fix this, or do we admit that our approach has failed and try something new? The answer should be obvious, but it won't be. Because in Washington, admitting failure is the one thing the establishment can't do. So what's the alternative? First, we need to stop treating Venezuela as a military problem and start treating it as a political one. That means engaging with the opposition, not just the exiled figures who live in Miami, but the ones still inside the country who are actually trying to build a movement. It means working with regional partners like Brazil and Colombia, who have far more influence in Caracas than we do, to create a path for a negotiated transition. And it means being willing to offer Maduro an off-ramp, something that lets him save face without rewarding his crimes. Second, we need to recognize that our adversaries are playing a long game, and we need to start doing the same. Russia and China aren't in Venezuela because they love Maduro. They're there because they want to erode American influence in the hemisphere. If we want to counter them, we need to offer Latin American countries something better than what Beijing and Moscow are selling. That means investing in infrastructure, trade, and development, not just sending in the Marines when things go wrong. Third, we need to stop pretending that military power is the solution to every problem. The Ford isn't going to fix Venezuela. Neither are more sanctions. Neither is another round of regime change rhetoric. What might fix it is a patient, sustained diplomatic effort, one that recognizes that the US can't impose its will on the world anymore, but it can still shape outcomes if it's willing to play the long game. But here's the: none of this will happen as long as Washington is dominated by the same people who got us into this mess in the first place. The foreign policy establishment is still stuck in the post-Cold War mindset, where the US could do whatever it wanted and the rest of the world would just have to deal with it. But that world is gone. The question is whether the US can adapt before it's too late. I'm not saying we should abandon our interests in Latin America. Far from it. The region is too important economically, strategically, and culturally to ignore. But we need to stop acting like we can bully our way to stability. The era of gunboat diplomacy is over. The era of smart power, where military might is just one tool among many, hasn't even begun. And that's the real tragedy. Because the tools are there. The US still has unmatched diplomatic, economic, and cultural influence. But we're wasting it on half measures and failed strategies. We're so obsessed with looking tough that we've forgotten how to be effective. And until we change that, we're going to keep stumbling into one disaster after another, whether it's in Venezuela or somewhere else. Now, what most people don't realize is that this dysfunction isn't just happening in the halls of the State Department or the Pentagon, it's baked into the very structure of how Washington makes decisions about Latin America. Take the last time the US seriously considered military action in Venezuela. It wasn't some distant Cold War relic, it was 2019, when John Bolton, then National Security Advisor, stood in front of a press briefing with a notepad that read 5,000 troops to Colombia. The media treated it like a serious policy option. The Venezuelan opposition, desperate for any leverage, quietly hoped it might happen. And yet, nothing came of it, not because the administration had a better plan, but because the system is so paralyzed by its own contradictions that even half-baked threats fizzle out before they can become real. Here's the uncomfortable: the US foreign policy machine is still operating on autopilot, recycling the same playbook it used in Iraq, Libya, and Syria, but with none of the conviction. In 2019, the Trump administration recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's interim president, imposed crushing sanctions, and even flirted with the idea of a naval blockade. But when it came time to follow through, the political will evaporated. Why? Because the establishment can't decide whether it wants regime change or stability, and it's too afraid of the domestic backlash from either. The left wing of the Democratic Party, burned by the Iraq War and wary of another endless intervention, would have crucified Trump if he'd sent troops. Meanwhile, the right wing of his own party, which had spent years demanding toughness on Venezuela, would have turned on him the second things went sideways. So instead of making a choice, Washington did what it always does: it muddled through, imposing sanctions that hurt ordinary Venezuelans more than the regime, while Maduro outlasted yet another US administration. Let me explain why this matters for our hypothetical scenario. If Venezuela ever did launch an attack on a US carrier, the domestic political fallout in America would be immediate and brutal. The hawks would scream for retaliation, the doves would warn against escalation, and the media would descend into a frenzy of speculation about World War III. But here's the actual decision-making process would be just as messy as it was in 2019. The president would convene a Situation Room meeting, where the Joint Chiefs would present military options ranging from a limited strike to a full-scale invasion. The State Department would warn about the diplomatic consequences. The Treasury Department would fret about the impact on oil markets. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, the president would have to make a call, not based on a coherent strategy, but on which faction in his own party was screaming the loudest that day. This is how the US stumbles into crises. We don't have a grand strategy for Latin America because we can't agree on what our goals even are. Is it about democracy? Then why do we cozy up to Saudi Arabia and Egypt? Is it about human rights? Then why did we support the coup in Bolivia in 2019? Is it about countering China? Then why are we alienating our allies in the region with tariffs and sanctions? The truth is, we want all of these things at once, and we're not willing to make the hard choices that would actually achieve any of them. Now, let's project this forward. Suppose Venezuela does something reckless, say, firing a missile at the USS Gerald R. Ford in the Caribbean. The first thing that happens is the 24-hour news cycle kicks into overdrive. Fox News would run wall-to-wall coverage of the act of war, while MSNBC would host Els debating whether this was a false flag. The president would give a primetime address, and within hours, Congress would be divided along predictable lines. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee would hold emergency hearings, where you'd have Lindsey Graham demanding airstrikes and Bernie Sanders warning that this could spiral into a regional conflict. Meanwhile, the Pentagon would be quietly running war games, trying to figure out how to respond without triggering a wider war. But here's where it gets interesting. The most likely outcome isn't a full-scale US invasion of Venezuela, it's something far more limited, and far more dangerous. The US might launch a cyber attack to disrupt Venezuela's military communications, or it might impose a naval blockade to strangle the regime's oil exports. It might even conduct a limited airstrike on a Venezuelan military base just to send a message. But none of these options would actually solve the problem. A cyber attack would provoke retaliation from Russia or China. A blockade would push Venezuela further into the arms of Moscow and Beijing. And a limited strike would risk escalation without guaranteeing regime change. The real wild card in all of this is the domestic political dimension in Venezuela itself. Maduro isn't just a dictator, he's a survivor. He's outlasted US sanctions, mass protests, and even an attempted coup in 2018. He knows that if he attacks a US carrier, he's gambling with his own survival. But he also knows that if he doesn't do something dramatic, his regime could collapse from within. The Venezuelan military is divided, the economy is in shambles, and the opposition is still fractured. In that context, a high-risk, high-reward move like attacking a US carrier might not be as crazy as it sounds. It could rally the military around him, force the US to the negotiating table, or at least buy him more time. But this isn't just about Maduro. It's about the broader geopolitical game. Russia and China would see an attack on a US carrier as an opportunity to test American resolve. Moscow would likely ramp up its military support for Venezuela, while Beijing would use the crisis to push for a diplomatic solution, one that would leave Maduro in power and the US humiliated. The Europeans, as usual, would be caught in the middle, calling for restraint while quietly hedging their bets. And the rest of Latin America would be watching closely, wondering if this is the moment when the US finally loses its grip on the hemisphere. So where does that leave us? The most likely scenario isn't a full-blown war, it's a prolonged standoff, where the US and Venezuela engage in a dangerous game of brinkmanship, each side probing the other's red lines. The US would impose more sanctions, Venezuela would make more threats, and the region would drift further into instability. And all the while, the real issues, poverty, corruption, the collapse of democracy, would go unaddressed. This is the tragedy of US policy in Latin America. We're so focused on the short term, on looking tough, on scoring political points, that we've lost sight of the long game. And the long game is if we don't start treating Latin America as a partner rather than a problem, we're going to keep lurching from crisis to crisis, each one more dangerous than the last. The question isn't whether Venezuela will attack a US carrier, it's whether we'll be smart enough to prevent it from happening in the first place. And right now, I'm not optimistic. Now, what most people don't realize is that this kind of brinkmanship isn't just a Venezuelan problem, it's a structural flaw in how the US approaches great power competition in its own backyard. We've spent decades treating Latin America as a secondary theater, a place where we can afford to be reactive rather than strategic. And that's exactly how we've ended up in this mess. The last time the US had a coherent grand strategy for the region was during the Cold War, when containment was the name of the game. Since then? A patchwork of half-measures, moralizing rhetoric, and the occasional military intervention when things get too hot to ignore. Let me explain why this matters. The US has two fundamental options when it comes to Venezuela, and neither of them is particularly appealing. The first is the path we're on maximum pressure, sanctions, and the occasional show of force. This approach assumes that if we squeeze hard enough, the regime will either collapse or come crawling back to the negotiating table. But here's the uncomfortable truth, it hasn't worked. Maduro has been under US sanctions since 2017, and not only is he still in power, but he's also managed to consolidate control over the military, the judiciary, and even parts of the opposition. The economy is a disaster, yes, but authoritarian regimes have a way of surviving economic collapse when they control the guns and the courts. Look at North Korea. Look at Cuba. Look at Iran. Sanctions don't topple regimes, they just make life miserable for the people living under them. The second option is engagement, and this is where things get really messy. The US could offer Maduro a sanctions relief in exchange for democratic reforms, or at least a commitment to hold free and fair elections. But here's the problem: any deal that leaves Maduro in power would be seen as a betrayal by the Venezuelan opposition and a victory for Russia and China. It would also set a dangerous precedent for other authoritarian regimes in the region, signaling that the US is willing to cut deals with strongmen if it means avoiding a crisis. And let's not forget that Maduro has a long history of breaking promises. The last time the US tried to negotiate with him, in 2019, he used the talks as a stalling tactic while he cracked down on the opposition. So why would this time be any different? But here's the thing, neither of these options addresses the root cause of the problem, which is that Venezuela is a failed state. The country's institutions have collapsed, its economy is in ruins, and its people are fleeing by the millions. The US can't fix that with sanctions or negotiations. What it can do is start thinking about Venezuela not just as a security threat, but as a humanitarian disaster that's destabilizing an entire region. That means working with allies in Latin America to create a regional framework for managing the crisis, one that includes not just military deterrence, but also economic assistance, refugee support, and a long-term plan for rebuilding Venezuela's institutions. It's not glamorous, and it won't make headlines, but it's the only way to prevent the country from becoming a permanent source of instability. Now, let's talk about the bigger picture. The real question isn't whether Venezuela will attack a US carrier, it's whether the US is prepared for the kind of asymmetric warfare that Russia and China are already waging in the region. Moscow and Beijing don't need to match the US militarily to challenge its dominance in Latin America. They just need to exploit its weaknesses. Russia has been doing this for years, using Venezuela as a forward operating base for its military and intelligence operations. China, meanwhile, has been quietly buying up Venezuela's debt, investing in its infrastructure, and positioning itself as the country's primary economic patron. If Venezuela were to attack a US carrier, it wouldn't be acting alone, it would be acting as a proxy for great power competition. And that's the part that keeps me up at night. The US is still thinking about Venezuela in terms of the 20th century, when the biggest threat was Soviet-backed insurgencies. But the 21st century is different. The threats aren't just military, they're economic, informational, and cyber. Russia and China understand this. They're playing a long game, and they're playing it well. The US, meanwhile, is still stuck in a reactive mindset, lurching from crisis to crisis without a coherent strategy. We saw this in Syria, where we allowed Russia to outmaneuver us diplomatically and militarily. We're seeing it now in Ukraine, where we're scrambling to counter Russian aggression. And we're seeing it in Latin America, where we're letting China and Russia fill the vacuum we've left behind. So what's the alternative? The US needs to start thinking about Latin America the way it thinks about Europe or the Indo-Pacific, as a critical theater in great power competition. That means investing in the region's institutions, supporting democratic governance, and countering Russian and Chinese influence with something more than just sanctions and military posturing. It means working with allies like Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico to create a united front against authoritarianism and corruption. And it means recognizing that the biggest threat to US interests in the region isn't a single rogue state, it's the slow erosion of democratic norms and the rise of a new axis of authoritarian powers. But here's the hard truth, none of this is going to happen overnight. The US political system is too polarized, its attention is too short, and its foreign policy establishment too wedded to the status quo. The best we can hope for is a gradual shift in priorities, one that recognizes Latin America as more than just a source of migration or a staging ground for drug trafficking. The worst-case scenario is that we keep sleepwalking into crises, reacting to events rather than shaping them, until one day we wake up and realize that the hemisphere has slipped out of our grasp. And that's the real tragedy. Venezuela isn't just a problem, it's a symptom of a much larger failure of US foreign policy. We've spent so much time and energy focusing on the Middle East and Asia that we've neglected our own neighborhood. And now we're paying the price. The question isn't whether Venezuela will attack a US carrier, it's whether we'll be smart enough to prevent the next crisis before it happens. And right now, I don't see that happening. The best we can do is prepare for the worst, because in a world where great powers are once again vying for influence, the US can't afford to take its own backyard for granted.